Again, good morning. My name is Mike Pissarro. I'm the Policy Director here at the Watershed Institute. Welcome to the final day of the Watershed Conference. I appreciate everyone joining us over this week, and hopefully you've had an enjoyable and learning experience. We're here for protection of soil resources on New Jersey preserved farmland. We have two great speakers. Susan Payne is the Executive Director of the New Jersey State Agriculture Development Committee. In her capacity as the Executive Director, she directs all aspects of the state's Farmland Preservation Program and the Right to Farm Act, as well as the State Transfer Development Rights Bank Board. We also have Jess Everett, who's the Deputy Executive Director of the SADC. He's been there since May of 2012, and he serves as the Deputy Executive Director and Chief of Acquisition. So they're going to talk about this program. Please hold, if you have questions, please put them in the question answer session, and we will get to as many questions at the end of the conference. Susan, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Very nice to be here. We are very happy to have received the invitation to address the group. I'm sorry we're not in person, but very appreciative of the fact you're all taking the time out to hear our talk today. So I'm going to go over a little bit of how we got here on the issue of protecting soil resources on preserved farms, and then I'll hand it over to Jeff, and he can tell you where we're headed. So Jeff, let's go ahead. So New Jersey's Farmland Preservation Program, I think it's easy to take it for granted in New Jersey, but it's significant nationally. Interestingly, the American Farmland Trust, which is a nationwide organization focused on the retention of farmland, recently ranked all of the farmland preservation programs in the country, and New Jersey ranked #1. And that is in no small part due to the commitment of the taxpayers of the state to support the program financially. But just to give you a little bit of the highlights here, we've preserved over 235,000 acres of farmland. And in terms of acreage, that's the fourth highest number of acres in the country. That constitutes over 2,600 individual farmland preservation deals, transactions that we've done, which is second in the country, second only to Pennsylvania. And of course, given how expensive farmland and all land is in New Jersey, the public has spent approaching $2 billion, and that is by far the most amount of public funds spent for farmland protection in the country. So, and in doing so, we've preserved about 1/3 of our farmland base, and that too is the highest percentage in the country. And the last point is really important, because what that means is for the Farmland Preservation Program, when we adopt regulations or change policy on preserved farms, it has a profound impact on the ag industry. I dare to say there's really not more than a handful of major operators in the state that don't have at least a part of their operation in the Farmland Preservation Program. So when we change policy or we promulgate rules, it ripples through the ag community and has a big effect. And so we are very aware of that, and it just impacts everything we do. Next slide. So just to give you a little bit of a geographic sense, here's a map of New Jersey. In the north, and you see that yellow and light green area, that's the New Jersey Highlands. And then that kind of sage-colored green in the south, that's the Pinelands. And then the areas in kind of lime green, that's all active agricultural land as of around 1999. And why that date's important because the program is a little over 35 years old. We made our first acquisition in the state in 1985. So we're 35 years old in terms of the time period since our first acquisition. And from the beginning of the program from the early to mid 80s up until the late 90s, the program relied on intermittent bond referenda, that appeared on the ballot to fund both the farmland preservation and the Green Acres program. So it was 50 million here and 20 million there, but it was kind of, stop and go kind of funding. And then in 1998, the public approved a constitutional dedication of sales tax proceeds under the Garden State Preservation Trust Act, and that profoundly increased the amount of funding available for both farmland and Green Acres across the state. So this little snapshot shows you kind of like how far we got with preservation before GSPT, and that was about 50,000 acres of farmland, or about 6% of the agricultural land base. Next slide. And this shows you roughly where we are today. So with Garden State Preservation Trust funds from the 10 years, from roughly, late 90s up till about 2010. This is how farmland was funded. And then from that point until 2014, we again relied on bond issuances to kind of get us through. And then in 2014, the voters approved a new and permanent dedication of funds through the corporate business tax to both farmland preservation and Green Acres. And I just want to pause here and make that point again. For many of you on the phone, you probably know that, that the corporate business tax, or as we call it, CBT, is a permanent funding source. And again, New Jersey, because the public has been so generous and so dedicated to land protection, we take that for granted, but when you go talking to other parts of the country about their funding, they cannot believe the amount of funding that New Jersey raises annually for land conservation. So we're very lucky to have that public support, and we work really hard to maintain that public support. So this is where we are today. Again, that number is a little outdated. It's about 236,000 acres of farmland and 1/3 of our land base. So we're about halfway to our goal. Somewhere between 500 and 550,000 acres is our goal. And so that's where we are today. Next slide. So the issue of specifically soil protection on farmland is the biggest issue we're working on right now, and is the biggest and most significant proposed rule and standards that the program's ever created. So this is a real, watershed moment for us. Excuse the pun, but this is a big deal, and this is going to set the table for what's permitted on preserved farmlands going forward. Next slide. So the whole issue emanates from a specific case, and this was the Garden State growers. This is a very large-scale nursery operation in Franklin Township, Hunterdon County. This farm was preserved, and here's an aerial photograph showing what the farm looked like when it was preserved by the prior owner, the Matthews family. It's about 120 acres, almost entirely prime soils. The black bars you see at the top of the screen reflect just weed fabric that was down, and the structures in the middle of the screen were hoop houses that existed at the time of preservation. Next slide. So the Matthews family sold it to Quaker Valley Farms under the name of Den Hollander. That's the family name, but the corporate name is Quaker Valley Farms. And you can see to the north, the top of this slide, you can see the adjacent large-scale gutter-connected greenhouse operation, and that is part of Quaker Valley Farms. That's basically their headquarters operation. And Quaker Valley Farms is one of the biggest nurseries in the country. They rank within the top 100 nursery operations in the country, to give you some sense of scale here. And so and the SADC takes no issue and has no objection to nursery operations or greenhouses. And we're actually really proud that, operators that are at that scale operate in New Jersey. But what happened in this case is, as you can see, Quaker Valley Farms constructed a large number of hoop houses, which is on the north side of this slide that abuts the other operations on the unpreserved lands. Again, the black on the screen is weed fabric, where they set out mums and annuals. And then that tan field kind of in the middle of the screen is about a 20-acre area that Quaker Valley Farms sought to level in order to construct more hoop houses on the property. And this is going back to 2007 is when the construction activity started. Next slide. So what happened is they used very large-scale industrial land moving equipment to prepare the site, much like you would use to build a Walmart. They cut it and filled it and compacted it to make it flat so that they could build their hoop houses. And I think it's probably obvious to everyone here that a hoop house or a greenhouse needs to be on pretty flat ground, right? Because air, warm air rises, and they're looking for a consistent, circulation, ability to move plants through the hoop house. All of that is made more efficient when the land is level. Next slide. But so what they did was, this was a gently rolling kind of 2 to 6% prime soil, and they sought to flatten it to less than 1%. So what you see here is a photograph aimed north on the site when they were in the middle of their construction activities, and you can see the hill, right? So the hill didn't used to look like that. The hill was just a contiguous, rolling of the land, but this is where they cut down in order to, make the topography level. Next slide. This is another view of that just on a rainy day, looking north on or west on the property. And this gives you a really good scale view of what happened. So again, you can see that silt fence along the right-hand side of the photograph. That shows you where the original topography was, and they cut down somewhere to around 15 feet in places in order to get the site level. Next slide. So of course the impact of that was they went all the way down to bedrock, and what you see here is bedrock that's been, basically shattered and distributed among the field as a result of the construction activity. So the virgin soil is gone. It's just not here anymore. Go ahead, next slide. So, so this raised the issue of, well, can you do that on a preserve farm? And so this whole case basically illuminated the fact that there are provisions in our standard deed that are in conflict with one another, or that are in tension with one another. So some of the main provisions of the deed, the first one is it prohibits non-agricultural development. But of course, building a greenhouse is not non-agricultural, so there really wasn't any concern about that provision. Another provision in our deed says that the land must be retained for agricultural use and common farm site activities. Again, greenhouses and nursery operations are not uncommon, so that really wasn't an issue. Paragraph 7 of the deed, however, says you can't conduct any activity that's detrimental to soil or water conservation or continued agricultural use of the property. And this is really the paragraph that we focused on in objecting to what Quaker Valley Farms had done. Again, we did not object to the fact that it's agricultural, but we did object to the fact that in conducting their agricultural operation, they destroyed the soil column, and therefore, once they were done with the property, when the next farmer were to take over that property, there's no soil left. The prime soils had been destroyed. And then paragraph 14 of our deed says that farmers can construct any buildings for agricultural use. So here you have this tension between paragraph 7 and paragraph 14. And this is really what the case was all about. Next slide. So the arguments by the sides, so Quaker Valley Farms, of course, argued that you know, hey, SADC, your easement's vague and therefore you can't enforce it. Another one of their arguments was that they had obtained a Chapter 251 permit from the Soil Conservation District, and they said, hey, that means we are, you know, quote, conserving soil and water resources. Next point. And they basically, and their argument was, well, if you really wanted to protect the soil, then your easement really needed to say that, but your easement was inadequate to protect the soil. And then they also finally claimed that because the SADC had not promulgated any standards and kind of drawn the line about how much is too much when it comes to soil destruction, that you know, we were kind of depriving them of their due process rights. So the SADC argued in return that, you know, permanently destroying 20 acres of prime soil is not consistent with paragraph 7 that requires that you conserve the soil resources. And this point that the destruction of the soil precludes it from being able to be used from the next generation and the next generation of farmers. And that really is the bedrock of our program. You know, we don't preserve farms so that one generation of farmers can use them. We preserve farms so that, you know, in perpetuity, one generation after another of farmers can use them. So those were our arguments. So in 2018, so this litigation started in 2008, and it went all the way up through the appellate division with more than one decision out of the appellate division, and then finally to the New Jersey Supreme Court that issued a decision in 2018. Go ahead, Jeff. So the Supreme Court said that they did have the right to construct hoop houses, you know, that hoop houses were agriculture, that clearly our deed contemplated the construction of buildings, but that they did not have the right to destroy so much prime soil in doing so. And the court really did adopt the SADC's thinking with respect to, you know, no one generation of farmers should have the right to damage or destroy that agricultural resource and basically take away that opportunity from the next generation of farmers. And, you know, I think one of the important points here was, and any of you that are, you know, spend any time with the law is, you know, we have to read our documents in their totality. You know, you can't take one provision of a law or one provision of a deed or a rule and just, you know, put all your eggs in that basket. That you had to read these provisions in their entirety and balance those interests. And so really that third point there, that, you know, agricultural uses are permitted, but they have to be carried out in balance with soil conservation. That's really what the court ultimately told us. And they finally said that, you know, Quaker Valley Farms' argument that they got a 251 permit, that was nonsense. You know, there was nothing in our statutes or our regulations that said getting a 251 permit was equivalent to complying with the deeds provision on soil conservation. So the court appropriately threw out that argument. Keep going, Jeff. So, but they also did say that, hey, farmers are entitled to clear standards. SADC cannot sit and kind of make it up as they go. As any of you in government know, that, you know, our biggest charge is we cannot be arbitrary and capricious. If you're going to tell people there are a limit, then you have to promulgate that limit through rules. And they basically warned the SADC that if we don't undertake necessary rulemaking, that we can expect due process challenges in the future. So basically the court said, all right, this is a case of first impressions. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody kind of contemplated a farmer would destroy a 20-acre field of prime soil. So you kind of get a pass the first time, but now you're not going to get a pass the second and third time. The SADC must promulgate rules to draw this line. And they basically said that it was only the extreme nature of the case that saves the enforcement action. So that's how we got to where we are today. And so since 2018, and really before then, we were working to develop standards that will draw this line, that will make it clear to the regulated public, what they can and can't do on a preserved farm when it comes to building agricultural infrastructure. So we're promulgating rules. And so this is really where Jeff will take over, and he'll talk to you about what those proposed standards are starting to look like and the shape that they're taking. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Susan. So before we delve into the draft rules, we want to give you an outline, the various components of this portion of the presentation so we can keep the discussion linear. And really, you can kind of distill this portion into three elements. How do you balance the deed of easement provisions? Susan mentioned the tension before between ag development and farmland preservation, which is a metaphor for the public's investment in this program. And what activities are considered disturbance? We need to define and refine that. And lastly, what are the limits for disturbance? Because if you're going to have rules, you're going to have to set a limit. So these are things that we actually, in 2014, we in a stage where we were starting to talk about it and put pen to paper. But then this case went to the Supreme Court. We waited for a decision. So now after that decision has been rendered, August 2018, now we need to get this going. So to that end, we've made a lot of presentations in front of county ag development boards, the Farm Bureau, New Jersey Conservation in a few instances. So today we're going to explore with you what we've been talking about and where we're going. So this is verbatim from the Supreme Court decision, and it really talks about there's really two purposes to farmland preservation. You got to strengthen the ag industry, and then you have to effectuate farmland preservation, which again is having land for the next generation. There's a lot of other benefits that accrue to farmland preservation beyond ag production, and we all know what they are. There is groundwater recharge aspects, carbon sequestration, which we can get into later, but you have to balance it, and you can conceptualize this balancing as equal weighting of conservation and development. Now, the courts didn't tell us exactly how to balance it. They just said that we had to do it through regulation because, as Susan mentioned, there's going to be due process challenges. So we're gonna conceptualize for you what we think this balancing is. Again, the courts didn't tell us, but it is our purview as a state agency to promulgate rules to effectuate our enabling statutes. So this is how we're interpreting it. And we really want to start with a premise that farmers need a substantial amount of infrastructure to be viable. I mean, the East Coast states, if you know agricultural history, we've always had this land pressure for a variety of different uses, commercial, residential, industrial, and even within sectors of agriculture, field crops, greenhouse crops. So what we're saying is that, this farm in particular actually is preserved in Warren County. There's a lot of development here, ag development, grain bins, but you got to keep in mind that this farm is several thousand acres with no buildings for the most part. And this is the headquarters. So we want to start with the premise that, we don't want to piecemeal this allocation of disturbance. We want to make it robust enough to allow for future ag development. The second thing we want to reinforce that the majority of activities on our farm are not disturbance. And that concept actually got a little out of control in 2014, to be honest. I think people expect the worst when they interact with the government. They think you're going to regulate to the worst offender. And there was kind of talk that every little thing that a farmer does on a farm is going to count towards disturbance. Well, it's not. The vast majority of activities, as we'll go through today, are not disturbance, if you will. In this particular photo, there's deep tillage, which is removing compaction in the hard pan from successive years of tillage, and that's perfectly fine. There's no limit on doing this. And really, there's a lot of things that occur on farms that are not just good for the operation, but good for the environment as well. In this case, this is gully erosion on the left, and on the right, the farmer worked with us and with NRCS to put in a grass waterway, which is one of the practices we fund under our soil and water conservation program, which we'll discuss later. And you'll see here that there is disturbance involved, but it's for a conservation purpose. So in this case, this is something that we could exempt in the rules. So with that being said, we really wanted to reset the nomenclature. Disturbance is, kind of implies you're guilty until proven innocent. And as you know, with independent farmers, that doesn't resonate. As a whole, I don't think I think we're used to certain freedoms with land use, and this did not resonate well. And that's just kind of the term that has evolved over time, is disturbance. It kind of, I think it probably, the antecedents may be in the construction industry. So we thought it'd be prudent to replace soil disturbance with soil protection, because what that does is imply, a certain level of stewardship. And for the most part, I used to be the chief of stewardship. And I think Susan has found this in her career as well, that, 99.9% of the time, farmers are complying with the deed of easement. Yeah, there's a bad actor every now and again, but that's in every sector of life. So in this case, call it soil protection and call it standards. It still is a regulation. Don't be under the misunderstanding it's not, but standards kind of implies we're going to set forth some more illustrative guidance, not just say, here's a rule, you got to live by it, and that's it. There's no discussion. So as we're going to lay out next, we think there's a path forward with how you can provide that illustrative guidance for farmers, and not just tell them what not to do, but help them understand what they can do. So that's really what a lot of the discussion has been so far with the county ag development boards and with our committee, is incorporate best management practices. And we took a cue from the Right to Farm Act, which has 12 promulgated ag management practices. And really, if you follow those under Right to Farm and you're a commercial farmer and you're complying with generally accepted practices, which the AMPs, are, then you can be, preempt local zoning, and you can, provide some protection from complaints that may be seen as unduly restrictive. So the same thing here. If a farmer follows these best practices for different activities that, yes, do affect soil to some extent, the goal is, if you follow them at the end of this, and if you pull up these practices, the next generation can change their operation without having a burden placed upon them from what, like Quaker Valley did. You're not going to be able to fix that. So, this is not Iowa farming, this is New Jersey farming, and therefore we want to give folks a New Jersey standard. And again, these practices are ones that you see, throughout the state, fairly ubiquitous. And New Jersey, in fact, has slightly more intense practices, a lot of gravel, some compaction, but really I think we have to contemplate this, because almost 40% of farms in New Jersey are either equine, nursery, direct marketing / ag tourism. And they use a lot of these types of surfacing. So, if we want to contemplate New Jersey-centric practices, these are more BMPs that we can promulgate on how to go about this properly to try to protect the soil the best you can. At the end of it, pull it out, and if they transition to grass-based dairies or whatever, then they're in better shape because they follow the BMP. So that's what we're thinking about here, and I'm going to show you a chart that brings this all together. But I'll make a last point here, which follows up on what Susan said. Some things are just soil disturbance unequivocally. There's no if, and, buts about it. We can't write you a BMP for it. There's not going to be an AMP for it. But it is necessary to effectuate ag development. There's going to have to be buildings to take care of your crops, take care of your animals. And if you see here, if you can see the grade markers, that shows you where the original soil profile is. So what we're saying is that, it's acceptable, but there's got to be limits. In the case of Quaker Valley, there's 20 acres developed on 120 acres, as Susan mentioned. If you do the math on that, that's 17%. So again, the courts didn't lay out specifically how we're going to promulgate these rules, but they gave us some breadcrumbs, I think, and we're interpreting 17% as too much. So keep that in mind as we go through the next phase of this, which is how much development should we allow on farms. Anyway, I think you all in the room that are biologists or different ecologists will know that the reason why cuts and fills are problematic is because it takes thousands of years to form a mature soil profile. So when you cut it, or if you fill it, there's some issues there, and there's no BMP you can write that can readily reverse that. And in terms of I would say that reversibility is the key operating word here. So we crafted this chart that really articulates different land uses on preserved farms. This is not the totality. Surely there's other things that occur on preserved farms, but this is most of these categories. And what we did is started to group these together in terms of, red is permanent disturbance, orange is semi-permanent disturbance, yellow is temporary, and green is soil protection, not soil disturbance. So if you look at the far left, you'll see this arrow, which shows degrees of reversibility. So in the Quaker Valley case, that was cuts and fills, which are red. I showed some practices that fall in the yellow and orange categories earlier, weave fabric and the like. So what we're thinking is for all the orange and yellow categories, we want to actually craft a BMP, which will provide guidance. And if a farmer follows that BMP, then it won't count as red disturbance. So that's a concession we're trying to make to try to, again, balance ag development versus farmland preservation interest. So we spent a lot of discussions the last couple of months on the language of these BMPs. So we'll continue to bring those every month to our committee after we first vet it with our subcommittee. And we'll put that out there for public consumption here shortly. Anyway, but one thing that gets lost is, a lot of farmers get upset when they see this. They think we're nickel and dime in everything they're doing, and they're going to have to follow these. The exact opposite is true. These are only out there if you voluntarily want to follow them. Some farmers may have very limited disturbance because they have a grain operation. They don't have to worry about these standards that they don't want. Now, if they don't care and they can put in whatever practice they want, that's fine. It's just going to count as red. But for those who want to be careful with the soil, whether for altruistic reasons or simply compliance reasons, these are there to follow and provide guidance to the farm community. They're not the nickel and dime. In fact, we don't have the administrative capacity to, we're trying to kind of set the limit and forget it. And if you want to follow these, that's great. We can certify that you followed them. But again, they're completely voluntary on the part of the farmer if they want to follow them or not. So this brings us, now that we kind of have explored, what is and what isn't disturbance, what are the degrees of disturbance, how much should you allow for these various, color-coded categories? And that's the big question, is how do you even go about figuring out how much farmers need without being too much? Well, that's why we hired Rutgers in 2010 to commission a study of 10 farms, mostly in central New Jersey. Now, we'll say for those who know statistics, 10 farms is not going to get you an adequate sample size, but nevertheless, it was an overture in a direction of trying to quantify disturbance. And that they did. And for me, I've delved into statistics quite a bit. What I did like is they kind of defined a methodology. So if you can see on this aerial photograph, there's a red boundary. And what that is the farm homestead. And the farm homestead is basically the headquarters operation for a farm. A farm management unit may be several non-contiguous pieces that are collectively farmed, some rented, some owned. But there's invariably a farm headquarters where the farmer lives, and within the farmstead, there's different zones of activity. So if you can see the blue zone in the top, that's a pertinent woodland, which we see a lot of on preserved farms. What you see in the green below, that's the core complex. And so statistically, of these 10 farms Rutgers studies, they calculated about 8% of the homestead is the core complex. So the next slide, we're going to zoom in on that complex, and you'll see that there's a purple zone, which they're calling modified uses. So basically anthropogenic uses within the complex. And of the core complex, about 40% of it is developed and 60% of it is undeveloped, AKA, curtilage, lawn, garden, farmyard. So once you back the purple category here into the red farmstead, about 3% of the total farmstead is actually modified uses. So keep this in mind, because we have to figure out a way to calculate how much disturbance is enough for farmers without conflicting what was defined in the Quaker Valley case. So given the limitations statistically in Rutgers' study, we thought it prudent to hire Rowan University's GeoLab, who's well known in academic and local government and state government circles for their prowess in geographic information systems. So rather than study 10 farms, we study the entirety of farms in the program. In fact, we study unpreserved farms to the tune of about 600, just to give us a statistically valid sample size of, what does development look like on farms that don't have any deed of easement restrictions. And believe it or not, get to the punchline, unpreserved farms actually have less development than preserved farms. And that's because preserved farms invariably are some of the better farms that have substantial development because they're still viable and they're signing up for farmland preservation because they want to continue that operation to the future. Anyway, what this whole yellow, green, red, orange methodology came about when we started to, Rowan measured every single individual land use on these farms. We started to group them together. And you can see here the line work is pretty impeccable. This is the typical equine operation, large track. In fact, they actually have 2 tracks. That's in red, the pasture is in green. And, yellow is essentially unpaved farm lanes. And then the red is around the complex is the, farmhouse and ag labor units and barns. So this study, if you put it on a histogram, we studied 2,700 farms. So the margin of error in this study is only plus or minus 1%. So 99% confidence interval in the data, because, close to 3,000 farms is almost a third of all farms in the state. So there's no smoking gun here in the data. I don't think we're missing anything. So this histogram shows that the vast majority of farms have 6 acres or less of ag development. In fact, the average ag development on a preserved farm is about an acre or 1%, because at the time the study was done, 100 acres was close to the average farm size. It's since dipped a little bit, but nevertheless, the 6 acres, I want you to remember it as we go through the next few slides. So beyond New Jersey, which we thought between Rowan and Rutgers and our own research in-house, pretty much covered, we wanted to look beyond and see other states that had a lot of ag development. I mean, I don't think it would be fair to the farm community to look at, Nebraska and Kansas to see the extent of ag development just because of the different type of farming systems in place there. We want to look at the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast and see, what are the counties that have the most extensive ag development and see what those numbers look like. So if you see here, one way to go about it is farms that have, or counties that have very intense livestock operations, because usually those are the ones that have the most infrastructure. And the purple dots are locations of processing plants for poultry, for dairy, etc. So I don't know if my cursor works on this map, but there's no surprise here. Upstate New York, southeastern PA, Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, Delmarva Peninsula, Cape Fear Basin, North Carolina. These are all areas that have very intense agricultural operations. So that's in fact what we studied. So those same counties are reflected in this chart here. Really the leading county in each state for market value of ag products sold. So nobody can say that we're trying to skew this towards, again, those wide open operations that don't have a lot of buildings. This is the most intense of the intense. If you look at the second column in the middle, the percent of farm acres and farmsteads. So this comes right straight from the Census of Agriculture. So this same category has been captured by the census since 1930. And it's not government telling farmers how much infrastructure they had. The farmers, per the census, are required to answer this survey. So these are the farmers' numbers themselves. And if you look here, the average is about 6% in the farmstead complex. Again, these are not individual disturbances. These are, collective disturbances. So I'll be honest with you, we just present data. We don't skew it. And people were surprised. They thought farms had like 30 or 40% development, and they just don't. These are the real numbers here. And on the right, that column tells you why they have this level of disturbance. It's animal agriculture for the most part. Some floriculture in there. And really, these are oblique photographs of these same geographies. And so it's not, as Susan mentioned earlier, we're not picking on greenhouses in this soil disturbance proposal. Soil disturbance can come from many types of operations, dairy and equine and hogs. But what you'll notice about these photographs is, yeah, there's pretty extensive infrastructure, but look behind them. Look at all the land that's open. So in these statistics, you'll notice there's a proportionality between building acres and open acres. And that proportionality was absent in the Quaker Valley Farms operation. They simply did not have the proportionality between open land and buildings. And that's because when you have an animal agriculture, you have to provide, grow enough crops to provide for your operation. You're not going to buy feed. That's not economically feasible. And also on the back end, you have to have enough land to spread your manure to be in compliance with the animal waste regulations. So that's why there's this proportionality. So what I look for is a rhythm, commonality, kind of a natural order of things, carrying capacity. I look for that more than kind of emotional rhetoric that, yeah, we don't have enough disturbance, you got to give us more. I mean, we looked all over the country and I feel confident these are the numbers. So at the top here, this is a recapitulation of those numbers. So 1% is what Rowan came up with studying preserved farms. But those are only individual disturbances. The Rutgers study also looked at individual disturbances. I broke those out here for you. They said 6%, but that was for the complex. But Rutgers study was only highly developed farms. So you can see why the Rowan number is more accurate because it includes all farms, not just those highly developed. So then you skip down to the 6% number, which is the third bullet point at the top. That's the USDA farm complex. And the reason why it's double Rutgers is because it includes undeveloped land. Remember I talked about Rutgers saying that about half of the farmstead complex was developed. So we thought we would work off the latter. Let's allow room for future growth. Let's not regulate to individual disturbances because that's just a snapshot of here and now. It's not a snapshot of the future. We think the farmstead complex is a snapshot of the future. So if you look under the proposed ag development limitation, aka soil disturbance limit, we're contemplating 8% of the preserved premises for those red categories. And I'll show you the chart again for a minute, in the next minute, so you can see, so you remember what I'm talking about. But we also wanted to say 8% or 6 acres, whichever is greater. And that's because small farms, those under 75 acres, 8% of that number would not yield a very high soil disturbance figure. And those very farms that are under 75 acres are the farms that are more inclined to need more of a soil disturbance limit. They need a higher one. So a question has arisen, hey, isn't that a lot of disturbance, 6 acres on a 50-acre farm? We think it's necessary, but also if you look at the total preserved farm acreage in our program, there's 238,000 acres as of like last week. Only 75% of that acreage is for farms 75 acres and above. So if you multiply a 75-acre farm by 8%, you get 6 acres. So the thought was there was a preponderance of farms under 75 acres that would benefit too greatly from this 6-acre number. But you got to remember that those farms under 75 acres only constitute 25% of our program, preserved acres. So it's not like this is a windfall for small farms because, again, 75% of all preserved farmland acres is over 75-acre farm size. And the next, we wanted to provide beyond the 8% a dispensation for gravel. Again, gravel, some may opine is impervious cover. We'll get to that shortly, but we think that gravel can be an elixir for erosion, which is our number one violation perennially, not large-scale development like Quaker Valley, but it's erosion. So gravel can fix erosion. So we want to provide another 5% allocation for that, but only if you follow the best practices we talked about earlier. Lastly, we're kind of kicking around 2% for farms that already are at the max at the time of the development of this soil protection limit. That to be fair to farms that had no idea this is coming down the road per se. We're kind of contemplating this additional 2%, and then essentially beyond these limits, you have to keep the topsoil on site. That's unequivocal. We have to, even if you would restore this site, which we are contemplating restoration standards for people who maybe inherited a farm that had an old dairy complex and they want to convert it back to cropland. I've seen this a few times over the years. We want to provide guidance on how you go about that and reverse that disturbance. So that's the numbers we're kicking around. And here's the chart again that you saw earlier. So if you focus on the right side, these are how those numbers that I just mentioned play out amongst these various land uses. So the cuts and fills, the asphalt, the concrete, that's your 8% 6 acre allocation. This orange category, which is kind of a hybrid between red and yellow, you get an additional 5% beyond the 8%, but only if you file the BMPs. If you don't file the BMPs, it counts as red. The yellow, there is no limit, but again, you have to file the BMPs. If you don't, it's red. And lastly, the green category would be limitless. There's no, we're not going to get into your business with those activities because they are soil protection rather than disturbance. And again, I mentioned impervious cover a few minutes ago, and really this is not an impervious cover regulation. This is separate and apart from that. So keep that in mind. Some of the activities are made part company from the FRPP and ill easements. So that's something I want to point out. And really what these limits may seem high to the environmental community, but keep in mind that, we have major population concerns in the world. How are we going to feed the world? So again, invariably ag operations that are productive and viable need a lot of infrastructure. So that's why we think it prudent to, craft rules that contemplate a generous allocation of the soil disturbance. So farms in New Jersey can, ideally you can feed your own state and you wouldn't have to import food. But also I want you to keep in mind that, I work for the National Park Service. I work for New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. Obviously, those considerations are involved in a program that touches on a lot of a broad-based constituency. DEP sits on our committee. But keep in mind that of the vast portfolio that is New Jersey land conservation, that only a small portion is farmland, 15%. So I opine that because it's such a small number, and that's not the case, Delaware, most of their conserved land is preserved farmland. It's a different paradigm altogether. But in New Jersey, I just want you to consider that most of these other lands that are aside from farmland do not have any kind of soil disturbance. They have very strict limits on what you can do. So ideally, your farmland program would be one that is all about farm viability. Obviously, conservation should be part of that, but it's not an open space program in the sense that these other programs are. I just want you to keep in mind that I think that we want to provide enough allocation for these farms actually to be viable. The last thing I'll mention before wrapping up here is I didn't talk about these green categories yet, and that's yet to be developed. But as Susan mentioned earlier, the CBT allocation that we get annually, hopefully a lot of you know this, and if you don't, you'll learn it now, but there's a specific carve out for stewardship activities, including those that improve the resiliency of farmland soils. We take that seriously, and that is another provision that we're working on. So soil protection, again, is not just about limiting what you can and can't do. It's also hopefully providing farmers with teaching them about a stewardship ethic that they can aspire to and that we can actually pay for using dedicated funds. And to that end, 4% of this stewardship of the farmland preservation allocation can be used for stewardship. And I just want to point out to you a few things you may not know about. Again, soil protection being part of a larger dynamic at play here. Again, not just regulating things, but helping farmers engage in practices that protect the soil. So this is our soil and water program that is funded by CBT. And most folks think of our soil and water program as only production practices, i.e. drainage, irrigation, etc. But there's a whole suite of practices that are conservation practices, and those are enumerated here for you. Every practice here we pay 50% on, and frankly, they don't get utilized because the Farm Bill programs, there's more funding there, and in some instances they pay more cost share than we do. But I want you to think about these, and as a way that SADC can further this dialogue with soil protection beyond the parameters of the soil protection rules. And I want to point out a couple practices in particular. I don't know if you all know that SADC can, for instance, pay for contour strip cropping and cover crops. And for your line of work, which is watershed protection, that's exactly what this soil and water practice endeavors to do. We reduce non-point source pollution, and we require corn stubble, crop stubble, and residue left on the field during the winter. And cover crops could be, in fact, a large part of climate change fight. And really, we're the only state in the country that has a farmland preservation program that even contemplates stewardship. So I think we're pretty far ahead when it comes to this. So I want you to keep this in mind, because the more we can work with farmers to, we need food production. That's just unequivocal. But can we farm in a way that doesn't, ruin the planet? And that's exactly what the UN has been studying for years. We got to feed people, a burgeoning population, but we have to do so in a sustainable fashion. So that's what soil disturbance, I think, contemplates, coupled with some of our other programs. So it's not just, this Quaker Valley guy disturbed the soil and now this set off this whole effort to tell people what they can't do. It's not about that. It's about producing food, but doing so without ruining the soils. That's kind of that's what we're trying to think about as we go along here. So really, the next steps in this process is to, talk to folks like yourself, talk to other interested parties, write these BMPs, put them out for public comment. On the side, our soil and water program is getting more interest. We're working with the NRCS all the time to try to get practices out there that do what cover crops endeavor to do. So to that end, I guess this is a Q&A period, and because that's all I'm wrapping up. That's all I have for you. And if there's any, you want to contact us, here's our Susan and myself's info. And if you follow this web link here, you'll see that all those half of the BMPs that we've talked about in public or online. You can actually read the text and see what they look like.
All right, Susan and Jeff, thank you very much. We have a couple questions. So the first one, proponents of the soil protective agricultural method seem to think deep tillage is damaging. So I guess, is it not? Is there ways to do it if it is damaging so it minimizes that damage?
Yeah, that's not, I showed that photo for the opposite reason, to show that we didn't count it as soil disturbance. Deep tillage is necessary from time to time to break up the hard pan. And in fact, conservation tillage is what I was alluding to with the cover crop slides. But with conservation tillage, you do get some hard pan that needs to be ameliorated. So to that end, deep tillage would be an acceptable practice. But what our easement requires is that you have a farm conservation plan approved by the local soil district, signed off by NRCS. These practices should be really done in concert with the plan, because NRCS has, countless resources to assist people on how to do it the right way. But yeah, deep tillage can be part of a regular tillage operation, and in fact, it is necessary to break up that hard pan from time to time. So it would not be considered soil disturbance.
All right. Another question, what is the timetable for rolling out new BMPs?
Well, yeah, so we are in the process. So SADC meets generally monthly. We have 10 meetings a year. And each month, the SADC is reviewing some draft BMPs. The process is, first we go to a subcommittee and kind of hammer out, our thoughts with that group. And then when that's ready, we bring it to the public and to the SADC at a public meeting. And if the SADC is sufficiently comfortable, then we're going to be sending them to all the stakeholders for comment and get those comments back so that we can develop a draft rule. I would say that both the soil protection limits, the 6 acres, 8% that Jeff was talking about, the red, yellow, green formatting, and the BMPs, they're going to work in concert together and they're going to be adopted together. So I would anticipate certainly in 2021, we're going to adopt these. So the coming year is going to be about, and we're doing it now, sending these out to our partners for informal comment. But I would say probably by the summer, we're going to be in a position of having a draft regulation for the committee's review, and then hopefully publishing it before the end of the year.
So I think that answered the next question. When do you expect the new standards to be in effect? So if you are proposing them at the end, does it go through the regular proposal and comment?
Yes.
So if you propose them next year, so you're looking at 2022 for adoption?
We'll see. You know, it depends on how fast things are working. But yeah, I would say this time next year, we're either going to be on the verge of adoption or it'll, you know, kick over into 2022 a little bit. But, you know, and I just want to say, you know, the formal adoption process, when you publish a rule as a proposed rule in the register and get formal comments, you know, the process to be able to change the rule substantially gets really hard at that point. So what we do at the SADC is we take our proposals and we get them out to the stakeholders for comments early, before we are in the register as a formal proposed rule. So if your organizations that you work with are interested in engaging and having input, now is the time. You know, because if we get all the way through this and people want changes at the last minute, that's a lot harder to accomplish.
All right, thank you. All right, here's a two-part question, so I will start with I guess, the beginning. First question, and go to the second one. At the October 22nd SADC meeting, Ralph Siegel asked an important question. Does the proposed 6-acre allowance of soil disturbance for farms under 60 acres exceed a federal limitation on private use for properties preserved with proceeds from tax-exempt bonds? So that's part one.
So the question is referring to a comment of one of the SADC members who represents Treasury. We don't have the time to go into private activity too much, but suffice it to say that when the public borrows funding to issue bonds, right? We're borrowing funds from the public to have a public project. Like if you were bonding to build a hospital, you know, there is a limit to how much, quote, private activity can occur inside that building that you built with public funds. And it's, you know, anecdotally, it's like a 10% limit. So you could, you know, have a Dunkin' Donuts or whatever inside your publicly funded hospital and not run aground of the IRS requirements on limits on private use. So the question was asked, you know, or posed, you know, whether there's a relationship between that kind of 10% private use limit of the IRS and a 10%, you know, or a similar limit on preserved farms for soil disturbance. And so I think they're kind of chicken and, well, I think they're two different eggs completely. It's not chicken and egg. It's kind of apples and oranges. So, but he raised, the important question he raised is, are there any tax implications or bond implications on this proposal? You know, and so that's a legitimate question, and that question has been referred to the Attorney General's office, and we're going to get to the bottom of it.
Sure.
The last thing we want to do is adopt a rule and then find out after the fact that there was some, you know, financial or bond impact that we weren't aware of. So we're glad he raised the question, and we'll get to the bottom of it.
All right. And I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and skip the second part of that because it seems more of a legal ethics / advice to client question. So to the questioner, sorry about that, but I'm going to skip that one. So the next question, do you all measure or evaluate the benefits of farm BMPs in any specific way? I personally don't know if I'm following that question, but if you guys do.
What I think I would say to that is we don't have a formal rubric to evaluate, but we really are trying to increase our connection with and partnership with NRCS, right? They're the agency that are the experts on soil conservation and its impacts. And as the country and as the state strives to meet its climate change goals, we are really trying to understand and participate in the discussion about, well, what should agriculture's role be there? And one of the questions you kind of run onto very quickly is, well, what is the benefit of implementation of grass waterways and reforesting riparian buffers and these kinds of things? So I'm hoping that as we continue to work with NRCS and get closer and closer, that we can begin to quantify, to measure, study, and quantify the benefits of conservation practices.
Thank you. Going back to the sort of proposal and adoption of these regulations, is there going to be after the adoption, is there going to be a period of time before they're actually implemented or enforceable? Or is it upon adoption, the next day if a farmer wants to start doing some of those practices, the new rules are applicable?
We haven't addressed that question. I guess I could say that my expectation is that they will be effective upon adoption. But if that's an issue that people think we need to think about more, or that you want to share some ideas or concerns about that, we're all ears. We would encourage you to send those comments to us.
Great. Is it possible to preserve farms of less than 5 acres since there are so many small farms in New Jersey? Smaller farms are exempt currently from farmland assessment taxes, from right to farm protection, and zoning exemptions for deer fencing.
The difficulty is that there's a statutory requirement that says that the preserved farm must be eligible for farmland assessment. So, and because farmland assessment has a 5 acre minimum, our wagon is kind of hooked to that. So that's really where that 5 acre minimum comes from.
All right. I think we've gone through all of the questions. So we still have some more time in the session. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Do that. And, as I was going through this and completely independent of my own thoughts, you did an analysis both statewide and countrywide, it seems, or at least regional wide, and found that 6% was sort of that disturbance level that was, I think it was 99% of all farms were at 6%, but yet your regulations are going to propose to have 8% and or 6 acres plus an additional 5% and then an additional 2%. So you're really at 15%. If you work that right, and it seemed, again, my own opinion, not necessarily generous, but you're creating a huge amount of ability for disturbances where it doesn't seem like that is what's going on in the real world.
If you look at that one slide that that Jeff had that looked at the regional differences, or actually the consistency between disturbances under the USDA reporting, you'll note that the highest disturbance actually on that list is in New Jersey, in Cumberland County, right? And it's in the nursery floriculture industry. And, that's the sector of New Jersey's agriculture that is the biggest contributor to the ag economy. So there's no doubt about that fact that New Jersey is a leader in terms of nursery operations, and nursery operations are those that are the most intense in terms of the need for disturbance, particularly as it relates to gravel use. And so we're trying to do something reasonable that leaves room for growth. I think one of the challenges in front of us is to deal with climate change in a lot of ways, and we are fully on board with, hoping that agricultural operators, whether it's no-till, operations and carbon farming, as they call it, carbon sequestration, reforesting, appropriate areas. We hope that's all a net positive, but we have to also look at the fact that the reason that Quaker Valley Farms wanted to put up those hoop houses was because they had potted mums sitting outside on weed cover that were obliterated during a nasty storm. And so farmers are going to have to do a couple things. They're going to have to prepare themselves for more wild weather. And we think that is going to require the use of more hoop houses and more protection for crops. And the second thing they're going to have to do is they're going to have to deal with more water, right? So we're going to have more intense storms. They're going to drop more water. There's going to be a need for more storage, stormwater management on farms as a result of climate. So we're trying to look ahead, as Jeff said, and not just take a snapshot of what's there today, but we realize there are very real challenges and pressures coming, and we want to create a standard that enables farmers to respond to these pressures that are out of their control, and not run aground immediately of these standards. And I just want to close by saying, from an environmental perspective, these look really high, and from an agricultural perspective, they look really low. Some farmers, are like, oh, I need to be able to put, way more buildings and way more greenhouses and way more gravel and a whole lot of things to survive. So as quote unquote generous as this may look from an environmental perspective, I assure you the view is 180 degrees in the opposite direction, when you're looking from many of our agricultural operators' perspective.
Fair enough. I don't know if we have other questions, so giving people a chance to think and type, I'll ask another one. So in your chart of green, yellow, orange, and red, you had a couple categories that were temporary practices. So I have to move everything away. So yeah, temporary structures, temporary parking and storage. Does the regulations define what temporary is? Is it 6 months? Is it 6 years? Is it the fact that it can be moved but may never be moved? What is the definition of temporary?
Yeah, Jeff, you want to address that?
Yeah, it's not, some are actually, there is kind of a temporal aspect with the structures. So we get into like run-in sheds that don't have a foundation on an equine farm, things of that nature that are truly temporary, but temporary in the sense of the chart is not of that ilk. Instead, it's more like you can reverse it more readily than you can the red. So it's temporary and simply the current generation, as Susan mentioned, nursery is a big aspect of Cumberland County agriculture in particular. There's a lot of geotextiles down there. That's temporary in the sense that they may not be the agricultural practices that predominate 25 years from now. So it's temporary in the sense that soil disturbance can be removed and more readily put back to another agricultural use, which is contemplated in our deed of easement when it talks about a variety of ag uses. So really, if you look at this, I'll regurgitate this chart. Permanent, which is red, is, the least reversible of all these. Semi-permanent is, there's not usually this is kind of analogous to a traffic light, but orange is a special carve out for New Jersey. We're calling that semi-permanent. Certainly more permanent than the yellow, but not as permanent as the red. So does that make sense? Hopefully the person asking the question will understand that. It's how easily can it be reversed. And obviously, the more easily it can be reversed, the more tolerances there are for it. That's why yellow has no limit, if you follow the BMP, but only if you follow the BMP. If you don't, it can be problematic. So that's again, if a farmer chooses not to follow it, that's on them. But we will tally that when we do the annual inspections. That's kind of how we envision it. But administratively, and as far as the farm community having one more piece of paperwork to do, ideally you set the limit generous enough, as Susan mentioned, that you can kind of set it and forget it. That these are only practices for those that are getting close to the limit. But I've actually had a lot of farmers say, look, I really appreciate the guidance because I'm just used to government telling me what not to do. This actually tells me how to do it better. So I actually did have a farmer reach out and say, look, I really want to put down geotextiles. I am concerned about the soil. I am concerned about erosion, which sometimes is a result of having a lot of weed fabric. How can I do it better? I do appreciate the BMPs because that gives me that guidance I'm looking for. So think about that. It's not just a negative component, it's a positive component. And thus far, the majority of CADBs I've talked to have at first not sure what the motivation was to draft all these, but after seeing some of these, they understand that these are for folks that can follow these. And as I used to work for NRCS, and as well-intentioned as they are, it does get challenging trying to figure out. There's 125 different practices in the field office technical guide, and there's only 20 practices under the soil and water program that we fund. And really, that's because those 120 can kind of be coalesced together in less practices. So it's a lot for a farmer to figure out how to even access the photog. We kind of want to make this the photog in that respect. And so I would look at those BMPs in a positive rather than a negative light.
The only thing I'll add to that is there are certain practices in that yellow category, such as temporary structures or temporary parking and storage areas. Those, for example, a temporary structure is like a tent, right? Like an equine tent. So if the farmer wants to put in, let's say 10 large equine tents for an equine event. So we have to deal with that. So when it comes to those kinds of things, temporary structures or temporary parking, we do contemplate the rules. Will say, okay, well, it can't be up for more than X number of days in order for it to be considered temporary. So, we're trying to deal with that as we need to. But like, an unimproved travel lane, that's not something somebody puts in, for 2 weeks and takes it out, right? That's a lane that farmer is going to use until they sell the operation. So.
All right, thank you. Another question going back to the sort of percentages of disturbance. This seems like it would allow a 20-acre farm to have 6 acres of cut and fill. Wouldn't that violate the Supreme Court's decision that 17% of the land being destroyed is too much?
So, we have to look at the Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court said that, 20 acres on a 120-acre farm was too much. They didn't say, 17% was too much. And so we look at that. We have to understand what they said in the context of the farm. And I think, what the Supreme Court said was, hey, SADC, you're the experts. You're the ones that are expert in the ag community. You need to develop a rule. And when we look at farms across New Jersey, the median size of farmland in New Jersey, if you rely on the farmland assessment data, is 22 acres, right? So we have a lot of properties out there that are, farmettes, let's call them, right? Now, most farms in the Farmland Preservation Program are not like that, right? They tend to be 25 acres and above. Occasionally, we have smaller farms. So, but when we look at those farms, if you have a 20-acre farm, well, what are you going to do on it to be economically viable? It's possible you can do niche vegetables and direct marketing, or niche livestock or dairy. But even there, even in niche vegetables, well, they're going to need to have some hoop houses, likely. So we were really trying to look at, what is it going to take for those small farms to be economically viable? Because this program is not about, an estate, like just putting a big old house on it and calling it a day. That's not what we're trying to do. And so the smaller the farm is, the more the pressure is to be highly efficient in order to be economically viable. And when you get small, you're going to need, infrastructure. And the smaller the farm is, of course, that same, barn and parking area and greenhouse on a 200-acre farm, it's going to be the same thing they put on a 20-acre farm. And so, of course, it's going to take a much bigger percentage. So I think that's our job, is to look at all of that and promulgate a rule that responds to the needs of small farms versus large farms, because they're really very two different kinds of operations. And, that's what we've been charged with. If we promulgate a rule and get challenged and, it goes back up to the court and they say, no, when we said 17%, we meant 70%. Okay, then we would have to change it. But we're trying to promulgate a rule that makes sense on the ground in light of what's been preserved so far and what agriculture needs to survive.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. And everyone, that is all the time we have for today's session. So Jeff and Susan, thank you very much for giving us the benefit of your insight and time and expertise on this. Super interesting topic. I've learned a lot. So again, thank you. For the rest of the participants, there is a few-minute break. At 10:30, we have one of two sessions going on. Green infrastructure and enhanced stormwater ordinance presentation. Sophie Glovier and myself will be giving that presentation. So no pressure to attend that one. And there's also a presentation on holistic ecological engineering approach for enhanced community flood resilience. That actually sounds very interesting too. And I wish I could be there, but I can't be in two places. So all of the presentations, all of the slideshows, and the video will be made available to all of the attendees, hopefully very early next week. We'll be sending out a link to that materials. I know there was a question earlier about getting the slideshow. So again, Susan and Jeff, thank you very much. And I will see everyone in a few minutes.
Thanks for having us. Hope to see you in person next year.
Yes, I look forward to that.
Bye-bye.
Take care.